also wanted to remember for the group that today is the date for 350.org, an organization brought together by Bill McKibben, and it's an attempt to focus attention on the number 350 with regard to parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So this is the day in which they are drawing forward worldwide attention to this issue, and we will also have an event later this afternoon to bring attention to 350.org, so just to alert you to that. We have, to begin our panel, a short film which has been made available of Professor Joseph Stiglitz, Nobel laureate at Columbia University, and his attention to efforts to focus on globalization with a human face. So if it's possible to run that film, let's begin with that.
First, I want to talk, though, about what is the underlying economics that is leading to the problem of emissions, a problem from which the whole world will suffer unless something is done. Just as the physical scientists have come to understand the nature of the underlying physical forces that cause global warming, economists have understood the underlying economic forces. And it's really very simple. It's called the problem of the commons. In fact, some people call it the tragedy of the commons. If you have a common resource from which anybody can take without paying the cost, there's a temptation to do that. The problem of commons was first recognized in the context, for instance, of the commons in UK and England and Scotland, where people would put out their sheep to graze in the commons, and more people would put out their sheep into the commons, and as the more and more of them grazed, there would be less and less grass, and each sheep subtracted from what was available to the others. And there could be so many sheep that the total well-being was undermined. We call that an externality. Each person, as he put more sheep, reduced the amount of grazing that was available to others. Exactly the same problem with our common atmosphere. Everybody takes it for granted as a common good. They all add their emissions, not thinking about what would happen if everybody did the same thing that they're doing. So each pollutes, and as each pollutes, the quality of the environment goes down. The greenhouse gas concentrations increase, and we face the problem of global warming. The world has faced these problems before, countries have faced these problems before, and have figured out ways of dealing with them. There are, in fact, two broad ways. The problem of the commons in England and Scotland in the 16th, 17th century was solved by privatization. You took the commons and put it into private hands. Of course, that made the people who were previously the ordinary people who were putting their sheep out to the commons much worse off. But it did result in efficiency. But no one is talking about the idea of privatizing the atmosphere. It's just an idea that is completely irrelevant. And that means that we're forced on the alternative way, which is regulation. In one way or another, we will have to learn how to regulate the emissions. Regulations can take a variety of forms, limitations on the amount of pollution, charging people for polluting. There are a variety of ways in which these regulations can work. But one way or another, we will have to make sure that the level of emissions is reduced. Now, why is it that the United States, the richest country in the world, refuses to go along? When President Bush became the president, he said, at first, there wasn't enough evidence, there wasn't enough certainty. Well, of course there's always uncertainty. But the weight of evidence was overwhelming. And this is an experiment. If things come out badly, we all will face a calamity. If it turns out that we are overly cautious, we cut back on our greenhouse gas emissions, we protect the environment a little bit better than we need, cost is minuscule. So here we're engaged in a one-sided bet. So the fact that there is uncertainty is no excuse. In fact, after he said the scientific evidence was not strong enough, he instructed America's National Academy of Science to look at the evidence, and they came out with the only answer that they could have come out with. They came out with the same result that every other Academy of Science that's looked at the data has come out with, and that is global warming is a problem. Global warming is being caused, or at least is partly caused, by the increases in the greenhouse gases, and that we can do something about that by reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. The second thing that the United States has said is that it's too expensive. This is nonsense. Clearly, if other countries can afford to reduce their emissions, so can the United States. There are countries like France, Japan, other countries around the world with just as high a standard of living that are polluting 1/2, 1/3 as much as the United States. So one can live just as well and pollute much, much less. America's standard of living is not in jeopardy were to go along with the agreement that every other country, the other advanced industrial countries, have agreed to. The third argument that they put forward is that unless the developing countries go along, it will be a meaningless gesture. And here, they're partly right. As I said, within 25, 30 years, the developing countries will be contributing half or more of the greenhouse gas emissions. And so it is imperative to bring them along. But they won't be brought along unless the world's largest polluter, the United States, also reduces its pollution. And this brings us to one of the central problems, the key issue which I think has led to the impasse in the global debate. The developing countries say the current problems of global warming have really been caused by the advanced industrial countries. They are the ones that are responsible for the enormous increase in concentrations of greenhouse gases. They can afford it. The poor countries do not have the resources, do not have the ability. If they spend money reducing their pollution, they'll have less money to grow, to lift their people out of poverty. Whereas what is at stake in the context of the United States is not a question of lifting people out of poverty. It's whether the United States continues with its energy profligate, its emissions profligate lifestyle. And for them, there's absolutely no comparison. To put it another way, what they say is, why should the United States, simply because it's polluted more in the past, be entitled to pollute more in the future? If the developing countries and the developed countries had the same level of pollution per capita, then the developing countries will not face constraints for decades to come. The per capita emissions of the United States is so much greater than that of the developing countries that the developing countries can continue to pollute and still, for decades to come, without reaching the emissions per capita level of the United States. The United States retorts by saying our level of emissions per GDP is lower than developing countries. And that's what's relevant. Now, it is true that poorer countries have less efficient technology, and the result of that is they often emit more pollution per unit GDP. But to say that you're allowed to emit more because your GDP is more is to say that richer countries should be allowed to emit more. And for the developing countries, this is totally unacceptable.
Thanks.